my best friend, sat at our dinner table and calmly announced she deserved half my husband because she had secretly loved him for 5 years before I ever knew his name. I dropped my fork when she said it. The sound of metal on porcelain was the loudest thing in the room for a full second, and then Priya just kept smiling, like she'd asked to split a slice of cake instead of a marriage. I want to share Daniel, she said again, slower this time, like I hadn't understood the first time. I looked at my husband. He was looking at her the way you look at a stranger who's just said something in a language you almost recognize. The candles I'd lit an hour earlier were still burning between us, and the pot roast was going cold, and none of that mattered anymore. I met him first, Priya said, in my heart, 5 years before you ever knew his name, Claire. You get him some days. I get him other days. It's not that complicated. Daniel set his wine glass down slowly, carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't steady enough to trust with speed. Priya, that's not happening. Her face crumpled into hurt, fast and practiced, like we were the unreasonable ones for not immediately agreeing to a custody arrangement for a grown man. I've loved him longer than you've known him existed, she snapped at me. Then she turned the full weight of her attention onto my husband. Tell her you've thought about me. I haven't, Daniel said. His voice was flat, but I heard the tremor underneath it. You have. You're just scared to admit it in front of her. She reached across the table and grabbed his wrist. He yanked it back so hard his chair scraped against the hardwood. Don't touch me, he said. See that? Priya said, turning to me with something like triumph. That reaction. That's passion, Claire. That's not nothing. I stood up so fast my own chair almost went over. Get out. We're done. Right now. Something shifted behind her eyes. The hurt drained out of her face and what was left was flat and cold, a look I'd never seen on her in 15 years of friendship. You'll regret making me the enemy, she said, quiet, almost gentle. Then she picked up her purse and walked out of my house without looking back. And I stood there in my dining room with my hands shaking and my dinner going cold, and the terrible, sinking understanding that I had no idea who I had just fed at my own table. Daniel didn't move for a long moment after the door clicked shut behind her. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, like he'd been holding his breath the entire time she'd been talking. I need to tell you something, he said, and I should have told you a long time ago. I sat back down across from him, the candles still burning low between us, and I remember thinking, even then, before I knew anything else, that whatever came next was going to change the shape of my marriage. I just didn't yet know it would change the shape of everything else too. Priya Chandrasekaran and I met when we were 19, in a dorm room at Portland State University, with cinder block walls and a broken radiator that clanked all winter. We were assigned roommates by a computer algorithm that had no idea what it was doing, and somehow it worked anyway. She was pre-med, I was studying graphic design, and by October we were the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences and split rent on a tiny off-campus apartment for the next 3 years. I was in her wedding party when she almost married a resident named Aaron in 2014, a wedding that fell apart 6 weeks before the date for reasons she never fully explained. I held her hair back the night she found out. I drove 4 hours to sit with her when her father died in 2016. For 15 years, Priya Chandrasekaran was the most consistent relationship in my life, more consistent than most of my family. I met Daniel Reyes in the spring of 2018 at a gallery opening in the Pearl District where a friend of a friend was showing photography. He was 30 years old and structural engineer for a firm that built bridges, and he made me laugh so hard within the first 20 minutes that I spilled wine on my own shoe. We were engaged by the following winter. We married on June 14, 2019, at a vineyard outside Newberg, Oregon, in front of 94 guests, and Priya was my maid of honor. She gave a toast that made half the room cry. She hugged Daniel afterward and told him to take care of me, and I remember thinking, watching them, that I was lucky to have both of them in my life at the same time. What I didn't know, standing in that vineyard in a $5,000 dress, was that Priya had met Daniel first. Not romantically. She'd been at the same gallery opening in 2018 before I ever spoke to him, and by her own later account, she had noticed him, approached him, talked with him for 20 minutes about a photograph of the Fremont Bridge. He didn't remember any of it clearly. I only found out about that 20 minutes 18 months into our marriage, and only because Margaret, her mother, mentioned it to me almost in passing, assuming I already knew. I didn't. Priya had never once mentioned meeting Daniel before I introduced them. There was a night, back in 2020, that I only understood in hindsight. Daniel and I had been married about a year. Priya came over for what she called a girls' night, except halfway through the second bottle of wine, she started asking Daniel detailed questions about his job, his family, his 5-year plan, questions that went on long enough that I eventually got up to do dishes just to give them room to talk. When I came back, Priya was sitting closer to him on the couch than she'd been an hour before, and there was a stretch of silence when I walked in that neither of them explained. I brushed it off. I told myself Priya was just lonely. She'd been single for 2 years by then, ever since the Aaron situation ended, and that she liked being included in things. I didn't think it was strange that my best friend wanted to spend an evening asking my husband about his childhood in Salem. I thought it was sweet that she cared. Looking back, I can trace at least 4 separate moments across those first years of my marriage where Priya inserted herself into spaces that weren't hers. She showed up unannounced at Daniel's 32nd birthday dinner with a gift more expensive than mine, a first edition engineering textbook she must have spent weeks tracking down. She started a running joke with him about a coffee shop near his office that I'd never been to, one they apparently frequented separately, on days I didn't know he'd taken long lunches. She kept kept, in her apartment, a framed photo from our wedding, not one with me in it, cropped, so it was only Daniel, laughing at something off camera, his hand raised mid-gesture. When I saw it on her bookshelf in 2021, I asked why she had it. Because it's a good photo of both of you, she said. There was no version of me in the frame at all. I let that go too. There was another moment, one I didn't re-examine until much later, from our own wedding weekend itself. Priya had insisted on staying at the Vineyard's guest cottage the night before the ceremony, rather than the hotel with the rest of the bridal party, telling me she wanted a quiet place to prepare her toast. I remember finding that slightly odd at the time, since every other bridesmaid wanted to be together that night, doing face masks and drinking champagne in someone's hotel room until midnight. Priya arrived to the morning of hair and makeup appointment nearly an hour late, her eyes red-rimmed behind concealer, telling everyone she'd barely slept because she was so excited for me. I remember hugging her and telling her she didn't need to be nervous. It wasn't her wedding. She'd laughed, a strange, brittle laugh, and said, "No, of course not," in a tone I filed away as pre-wedding exhaustion and never thought about again until Margaret told me, years later, what that night had actually held for her. There was a birthday dinner in 2022, mine, not Daniel's, where Priya arrived 20 minutes late and spent most of the evening asking Daniel questions about a work trip he'd taken to Seattle the previous month, a trip I hadn't gone on because of a client deadline. She wanted details, which hotel, which restaurants, whether he'd been lonely in the room alone. At the time, I thought she was just making conversation, filling space the way people do at dinners when the guest of honor is mid-bite and can't easily jump in. Looking back, I recognize it as something closer to an interrogation, gathering information about a life she had already decided, somewhere in her own mind, belonged partly to her. Before all of this, Priya and I had what I would have called, without hesitation, one of the best friendships of my life. She was the person I called when my mother was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer in 2017. She was the one who sat with me in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours during my father's hip surgery. She lent me $1,100 in 2015 when my car transmission failed and I hadn't built up savings yet, and she never once brought it up again after I paid her back. She was, by every measure I had, one of the most loyal people I knew. That's what made all of it so hard to see coming, and so hard to believe once it arrived. You don't expect the person who held your hand through your father's surgery to sit at your dinner table 4 years later and calmly propose splitting your husband like a piece of property. 2 days after she stood up from my dinner table and told me she deserved half my husband, Priya showed up at our front door with grocery bags, knocking like nothing had happened at all. Daniel watched through the front window while I stood frozen in the hallway. She had a canvas bag in each hand, the kind she used for her weekly farmer's market runs, and she was smiling the exact same smile she'd worn 100 times before, dropping by unannounced the way she'd done for a decade. We didn't open the door. We stood in the kitchen and listened to her knock 4 more times, patient, unhurried, and then we heard her set the bags down on the porch and walk away. When we opened the door 20 minutes later, there was a note tucked under the handle of one bag. "I love you both," it said, in her looping handwriting. "I'm not giving up on us." There was no explanation, no apology, nothing that acknowledged what she had said 48 hours earlier. It was as if she believed the 3 of us were simply in a temporary disagreement, the kind you talk through over groceries. That night, after we'd thrown the bags away untouched, Daniel sat me down on our bed and handed me his phone without a word. His hands were shaking. I scrolled through a thread of text messages that went back 8 months, hundreds of them, all from Priya. Almost none of them answered. "I had a dream about you last night. I know you feel it too. You don't have to hide it from me. I'm going to tell her soon, I promise. I just need the right moment." There were photos she'd sent him of herself, casual ones, taken at angles that weren't accidental. There were messages sent at 2 and 3 in the morning. There was one from the previous February that read, "I know this isn't fair to Claire. I've made peace with that." Daniel swore, sitting on the edge of our bed with his head in his hands, that he had never responded to a single one. I believed him because the pattern of the conversation made it obvious. Her messages arrived in bursts, sometimes 6 or 7 in a row, with no replies breaking up the rhythm. He had been receiving this for 8 months and telling no one, not even me, because he said he thought he could make it stop quietly, without blowing up the friendship I'd had since I was 19. I understood the impulse. I hated that he'd made that choice for both of us. We had our first real fight of the marriage that night, not about Priya, but about the 8 months of silence. The next morning, I walked through our house looking at it differently for the first time since we'd bought it in 20 by 20. My closet, which I organized by color, had been reorganized by sleeve length, a system I never use. The framed photos on our refrigerator, held up by magnets, had been shifted, subtly, the way things move when someone straightens them without really understanding your original arrangement. I stood in my own kitchen with a rising, nauseated feeling that someone had been inside my house, touching my things, moving through my private spaces like they belonged there. When Daniel and I searched his desk drawer that afternoon, we found our wedding photo, the formal one, the 94 guests, the vineyard, with Priya's face cut from another photograph and taped in beside ours. Someone had drawn a heart in ballpoint pen around all 3 faces. On the back, in the same looping handwriting from the note, "Soon." We didn't know how long it had been sitting in that drawer. Daniel said he hadn't opened it in months. We called a locksmith that week and had every lock in the house changed. Front door, back door, the side door off the garage that we never used. I told myself that would be the end of it. That a woman in her mid-30s with a stable job as a physician's assistant assistant would not escalate past a note and a defaced photograph. I was wrong within 72 hours. I came home early from work on a Thursday, ahead of my usual schedule because a client meeting had been canceled. The front door was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning, the way I lock it every morning, out of habit built over 6 years in that house. I stood on the porch for a moment, my heart going fast before I pushed the door open. Priya was standing at my stove. She was wearing an apron I had never seen before, blue with small white flowers, stirring a pot of something that smelled like the chicken tikka masala she used to make in our college apartment. She turned when the door opened and looked at me with no guilt at all, just mild surprise, the way you'd look at someone arriving slightly ahead of schedule for their own dinner party. "You're home early," she said. "Dinner's almost ready." "Why are you in my house?" I said. It wasn't a question. My voice didn't sound like my own voice. "I wanted to show you what it could be like," she said, still stirring, like this was the most reasonable explanation in the world. Daniel mentioned once, years ago, that he missed home cooking. I remembered. I asked her very slowly how she had gotten in. She told me without hesitation that she'd made a copy of my spare key back in 2021 when I'd asked her to water my plants during a trip to visit my mother. I had genuinely forgotten I'd ever given her a key. She said she'd meant to give it back and simply never had. When I asked how long she'd been coming into my house, she considered the question like she was doing actual math. "Months," she said. "Sometimes just to sit for a while. Sometimes to reorganize a little. Tidy up things you'd let slip." She said it the way you'd describe a favor. I understood, standing in my own kitchen while she stirred a pot on my stove, that I was talking to someone who did not experience this as a violation. I took my phone out of my pocket, set it against the fruit bowl on the counter at an angle where the camera could see both of us, and hit record without telling her. "Why are you doing this?" I asked again, on camera this time. "Because I love him," she said simply, still stirring. "I've loved him for 5 years. Before you knew his name, Claire. I was there first, even if nobody wants to admit it. That's breaking and entering," I said. "You know that." She actually laughed. A light, genuine laugh, the kind she used to laugh at my jokes in our old apartment. "Not when you have a key," she said. That was when Daniel walked in through the garage door, home even earlier than I was, and froze in the doorway to the kitchen. Priya's whole face lit up the instant she saw him, an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that had nothing hidden in it at all, which was somehow worse than if she'd looked afraid of being caught. Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling the police," he said. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. What happened next took less than 15 seconds, but it's the 15 seconds I've replayed more than any other part of that year. Priya's hand came up and struck her own cheek hard, and then again, harder, and she started screaming. Not words at first, just a raw, escalating sound. And then words, "Stop hitting me. Stop, please stop," while she clawed 4 red lines down the side of her own neck with her nails. I grabbed both her wrists to stop her from hurting herself further, an instinct faster than thought, and the second my hands closed around her wrists, I understood exactly what it would look like on the recording still running against the fruit bowl. The second I let go and stepped back, her face went completely still, all the panic draining out of it in an instant, replaced by something calm and almost amused. "You didn't think I saw the phone?" she said. "All you have is audio of me begging him to stop. That's all that recording will ever show." She was right. I checked it later, sick to my stomach, and the footage showed exactly what she wanted it to show. My hands on her wrists, her voice pleading, no context, no explanation, nothing that proved what had actually happened in that kitchen. She'd staged her own victimhood inside a 15-second window while a hidden camera watched, using our own attempt at evidence against us. She kissed us both on the cheek on her way out, unbothered, humming faintly, and walked to her car like she was leaving a pleasant dinner party instead of the scene of a break-in she'd just confessed to on camera. We deleted the footage that night. It was worse than useless. It was ammunition for her, not for us. We changed the locks again the next morning, this time with a locksmith who installed a deadbolt keyed differently from anything Priya could have copied, plus a chain lock she'd have to physically break to get past. Daniel installed a doorbell camera that afternoon, the kind that records to the cloud, the kind that couldn't be deleted or staged around. I sat on our back porch that evening, exhausted in a way I'd never been exhausted before, and I thought about the fact that I had known this woman for 15 years and still had no real idea what she was capable of. I thought the new locks would be the end of it. They weren't. Priya didn't try the house again, not that we know of, but within a week she'd found a different door to walk through. She started messaging our mutual friend group, a loose circle of 6 women who'd known both of us since our 20s, with a story that had been carefully sanded down to sound reasonable. She told them Daniel and I were going through something private, and that she was just trying to help as a friend caught in the middle. She never mentioned the dinner table announcement. She never mentioned the key. By the time I heard about it, 2 of those friends had already texted me asking if I was okay, if Daniel and I were having problems, if there was anything they could do. I had to explain from scratch to people I'd known for over a decade that my best friend had sat at my table and asked to split my husband, and I watched in real time as some of them struggled to reconcile that with the Priya they thought they knew. Steady, reliable, the one who organized birthday dinners and remembered everyone's allergies. One friend, Renata, said something that stayed with me for weeks. She's never once seemed like that to me. I didn't have an answer for that. Neither had I for 15 years. Before the office, office, there was a dinner. Renata organized it, a well-meaning attempt to get everyone in the same room to clear the air, not fully understanding yet what she was inviting into her own dining room. Priya arrived acting wounded before anyone had said a word to her, sitting at the far end of the table with her arms crossed, waiting for someone to ask what was wrong. When Renata finally did, Priya delivered a version of events so carefully edited, it barely resembled anything that had actually happened. She said she'd made an emotional confession at our dinner table and that I had completely overreacted, banning her from our lives over what she called an honest moment of vulnerability. She never mentioned the key. She never mentioned the texts. She cried quietly, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, and said she just wanted her friend back, that she didn't understand why 15 years had to end over one hard conversation. I sat there watching 3 other women at that table soften toward her in real time, their faces shifting from confusion to sympathy, and I understood, with a cold, sinking clarity, that Priya was gifted at exactly this, building a story where she was the wounded party, using our shared history as leverage, and letting other people's love for both of us do the work of doubting me. I left that dinner early, shaking, and it took me 2 full days to convince Renata of what had actually been said at my own table, because Priya's version had gotten there first and arrived so much softer than the truth. I ended up forwarding Renata screenshots of the 8 months of texts, blacking out nothing, because I no longer trusted my own account to be believed on its own, and it was only after she scrolled through them in real time, her face going pale over speakerphone, that she finally understood the gap between what Priya had performed at that dinner table and what had actually been happening for months. Then Priya showed up at Daniel's office. He worked out of a firm in the Lloyd district, a mid-rise building with a lobby security desk that checked visitors in and issued badges. On a Tuesday afternoon, she signed in using her real name, telling the front desk she was an old friend stopping by to surprise him for his birthday, which was nowhere close. She got as far as the elevator bank on his floor before one of his co-workers, a project manager named Suresh, recognized her from photos on Daniel's desk and mentioned to Daniel afterward that your friend Priya was looking for you. Daniel found her sitting in the small waiting area outside his team's office, legs crossed, scrolling her phone like she had every right to be there. When he asked her to leave, she told him, loudly enough for 2 colleagues to hear, that she just wanted 5 minutes to talk like adults. He walked her to the elevator himself and stood there until the doors closed. He told me about it that night with his jaw tight, the specific kind of tight that meant he was furious and trying not to show it, because showing it in front of coworkers would have raised more questions than either of us wanted to answer at work. In between the office incident and my decision to track down Margaret, Priya tried one more angle, a quieter one. She sent me a single text, the first direct message since the dinner table, reminding me of the $1,100 she'd lent me back in 2015, phrased as though she were simply reminiscing, not threatening anything. Remember when I helped you with the transmission, no questions asked, she wrote. I've always shown up for you when it mattered. I didn't respond. Daniel pointed out, when I showed him the message, that she'd never once brought up that loan in the 9 years since I'd repaid it, and that resurrecting it now, unprompted, in the middle of a stalking campaign, wasn't nostalgia. It was leverage, dressed up as memory, an attempt to remind me of a debt I no longer owed in the hope that I'd feel I still did. That was the moment I decided I needed to understand where this was coming from, not just how to survive the next escalation. In 15 years of friendship, Priya had told me almost nothing concrete about her mother. I knew her name was Margaret. I knew she lived somewhere outside the city, in Gresham or Troutdale. I was never sure which. I knew Priya visited her maybe twice a year, always alone, and always came back from those visits quieter than usual for a few days. I had asked over the years if I could come along sometime, and Priya always had a reason it wasn't a good time. Margaret wasn't feeling well. Margaret didn't like visitors. Margaret's house was being renovated. After 15 years, I had never once met my best friend's mother, and until that week, it had never once struck me as strange. Best friends don't always meet each other's whole families. But once I started actually looking for the thread that connected Priya's calm, entitled announcement at my dinner table to some kind of origin, her mother was the only place I hadn't already searched. I found Margaret Chandrasekaran on a community Facebook page for a Lutheran church in Troutdale, tagged in a photo from a fall festival bake sale. Her profile was mostly public, between posts about hymn schedules and a grandson I didn't know existed. Priya had a nephew she'd never once mentioned in 15 years. There was enough information to place her address within a single search. She lived on a quiet street off Stark Street, in a small blue house with a wheelchair ramp built onto the porch. Daniel and I sat in our car outside that house for almost 10 minutes before either of us got out. Margaret opened the door before we knocked a second time. She was a small woman, maybe 65, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and the particular tiredness in her eyes of someone who has been waiting for a knock like this for a long time, without knowing exactly when it would come. I know who you are, she said, looking between the two of us. You're Claire, and you must be Daniel. She stepped back from the door to let us in, and there was no surprise in the gesture at all, just a kind of resignation, like she'd rehearsed this exact moment in her head more than once. Her living room smelled like lavender and old carpet. There was a crucifix on one wall and a shelf of ceramic birds on another, and in the corner, a recliner with a folded Afghan that looked like it had been sat in every day for 20 years. She offered us tea. We said no. She sat down across from us anyway, hands folded in her lap, and waited for me to start talking, like she already knew this conversation was coming and had simply been waiting for the right visitors to arrive. I told her everything. The dinner table, the 5 years, the texts going back 8 months, the reorganized closet, the defaced wedding photo, the key she'd never returned, the staged self-harm in my own kitchen. I watched Margaret's face while I talked, and she didn't look shocked. She looked like a woman confirming something she'd feared for a long time, finally saying yes, that matches what I already suspected, without saying the words out loud. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she got up, walked to a bookshelf, and pulled down a photo album I hadn't noticed among the ceramic birds. She set it on the coffee table and opened it without a word. It was full of pictures of Daniel. Not photos from our wedding, not photos Priya had a right to have. These were candid shots, printed from what looked like social media, some of them cropped tight on his face, some clearly zoomed and resaved from Instagram posts I remembered making years earlier. There were dozens of them, arranged with the kind of care you'd give a scrapbook of your own child's milestones. Daniel went very still beside me, turning pages slowly, looking at photographs of himself he had never given anyone permission to keep, let alone curate into an album. She's kept that since 2018, Margaret said quietly. I found it by accident, cleaning her apartment 2 years ago while she was at a conference. There were candles arranged around some of the pages, like she stopped herself, pressed her lips together, like a shrine. I didn't know what to do with what I was looking at. I put it back exactly where I found it, and I never told her I'd seen it. I told myself it was harmless, a crush that never grew up. I was wrong to tell myself that. Tucked into the back cover of the album was a spiral notebook, its pages soft from handling. Margaret hesitated before opening it, glancing at Daniel like she was asking permission to expose something he hadn't consented to. Inside, in the same looping handwriting from the note on our porch, page after page was filled with entries addressed directly to him, dated over 5 years, some of them only a line or two, some running for pages. Daniel Reyes came into the coffee shop again today. He didn't notice me watching from the corner table. Someday he will. There were entries from our wedding week itself, written in a hand that looked pressed hard enough into the paper to tear it in places. I am happy for them. I am happy for them. I am happy for them, repeated 9 times down half a page, like a mantra someone was trying to force themselves to believe. Daniel closed the notebook himself, gently, and set it back on the coffee table, and none of us spoke for almost a full minute. Then Margaret said something that made the room go very quiet. She tried to end her life the night before your wedding, she said, looking at me directly now, not flinching from it. I found her on the bathroom floor of her apartment. She'd swallowed most of a bottle of something, I don't even remember what anymore. I just remember the ambulance and the hospital and telling the nurse it was a stomach flu because Priya begged me not to tell anyone the truth. She didn't want you to know. She didn't want it to interrupt your wedding day. My stomach dropped in a way I can't fully describe. Daniel's hand found mine on the couch cushion between us. Gripping hard, Margaret kept going. Like now that the door was open, she needed to walk all the way through it. She called the venue, your vineyard, about 10 days before the wedding. She told them there'd been a family emergency and asked if the date could be pushed. I only know this because the coordinator called our house looking for her afterward, confused, since Priya had used our home number as a contact. I asked Priya about it, and she told me it was a misunderstanding, that she'd been asking about a different event for her nephew's christening. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Daniel's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. She sent me a letter, right before the wedding, anonymous. It said Claire was cheating on me, that I should look at her phone before I made a mistake I couldn't take back. He looked at me. I threw it away. I never told you because it felt like garbage, not worth repeating. I didn't think— He stopped. I didn't think anyone I knew would do something like that. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. That sounds like her too, she said. I'm sorry. I should have paid closer attention. I told myself for years that a daughter who loved someone quietly, who never acted on it, wasn't hurting anyone. I was wrong. I think I've been wrong for a long time. She was still talking, still explaining a decade of small warning signs she'd allowed herself to reframe as harmless, when the front door slammed open behind us without a knock. Priya stood in the doorway, chest heaving like she'd run from her car, her eyes moving fast between the 3 of us and landing on the open photo album on the coffee table. Her face went through something complicated in the span of a second. Shock, then betrayal, then a fury I had genuinely never seen on her in 15 years. You went to my mother? She said, staring at me. You're trying to turn her against me, after everything I've done for you. Priya, Margaret said, standing up, her voice trembling but not backing down. Sit down. We need to talk about the hospital again. We need to talk about getting you real help. Priya ignored her entirely, turning the full force of her attention on me instead. You stole him, she said. You knew how I felt, somewhere. Deep down you knew, and you took him anyway. I didn't know, I said, and I meant it, and I could hear how flat and tired my own voice sounded saying it. I didn't know until 3 weeks ago that you'd even met him before I did. You never told me, not once, in 15 years. Because it wasn't your business until it needed to be, she snapped. Daniel stood up slowly from the couch. I don't have feelings for you, he said. His voice was steady in a way I hadn't heard from him in weeks, like something in him had finally settled into certainty. I never have. Not once. Not for 1 second. In 5 years of knowing you. You need help, Priya. Real help. Not this. Her face twisted. the corners of her mouth pulling down in something between grief and rage. "You're lying," she said. "You're lying because she's standing right there." "I'm not lying," Daniel said. "I've never lied about this to you. You've just never once believed me, because believing me would mean this whole thing was never real." Margaret tried again, gentler this time, reaching toward her daughter. "Priya, please, come sit with me. Let's call Dr. Okafor together right now, like we talked about before." Priya jerked back from her mother's hand like it had burned her. Then, without any transition I could follow, without any warning in her face, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She turned the screen toward us, showing a map with a single blinking dot moving slowly along a familiar street. "An air tag," she said, and her voice had gone strange and flat, almost pleasant, the way it had sounded in my kitchen while she stirred a pot that wasn't hers to stir. "In your car, Claire. I've always known where you are, both of you, every day, for months." The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I thought about every grocery run, every doctor's appointment, every quiet Sunday drive, every single ordinary day of my life for the past several months, tracked in real time by someone I had trusted with my house key and my wedding party and the worst days of my life. "I've watched you through your window," she told Daniel, almost gently, like she was giving him a gift. "The bedroom one, the one that faces the side street, just to see you, just to know you were still there, still real, still worth waiting for." Somewhere outside, distant but growing closer, I heard the first thin wail of a siren, and I realized Margaret must have pressed something, called someone, the moment Priya walked through her door with that look on her face. Priya heard it too. Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back to the three of us standing together against her. Her mother, her best friend, the man she'd built a shrine to in a house none of us had been invited into for 15 years. "You're all against me," she whispered, and something in her voice cracked open, raw and young, like a child realizing for the first time that the world does not simply rearrange itself around what she wants. Then she lunged, not at Daniel, but at me, both hands out, reaching for my throat or my hair or anything she could get purchase on, and I threw my arm up on instinct and stumbled backward into the bookshelf, sending a ceramic bird crashing to the floor. Daniel grabbed her from behind, wrapping both arms around her middle and hauling her back before she reached me, and Margaret was screaming her daughter's name, and the siren outside had become two sirens, close now, turning onto the street. Priya fought against Daniel's grip for maybe 5 seconds, thrashing, screaming something I couldn't fully make out, half words and half sound, and then all at once she went limp, like a puppet with the strings cut, sobbing into the space where his arms held her, repeating one phrase over and over. "I just wanted to be first. I just wanted to be first for once in my life." The police came through Margaret's front door less than a minute later. There were 2 officers, a man and a woman, and Margaret met them in the doorway already talking, explaining fast, the words spilling out of her like she'd been holding them back for years, and the dam had finally gone. Daniel let Priya go the moment the officers took over, stepping back with his hands raised, and I watched my best friend of 15 years get walked, unresisting now, quiet now, toward the back of a patrol car parked crooked in her mother's driveway. The weeks after that afternoon in Margaret's living room unfolded slower than I expected, and messier than I could have prepared for. Priya was charged with criminal trespass and stalking, both misdemeanors given the specifics of the case, though the detective who took our statement told us privately that the AirTag alone, combined with the pattern of entries into our home, made a stronger case than most stalking complaints she'd seen that year. We filed for a restraining order the same week. The paperwork process took 4 appointments at the county courthouse, 2 of which required both Daniel and me to sit in a waiting room down the hall from Priya's own attorney, closer to her than either of us wanted to be, while a judge reviewed the evidence, the texts, the doorbell footage from the new camera, the photo album Margaret voluntarily handed over to police, still smelling faintly of her lavender living room. My mother, when I finally called her, drove up from Salem the same afternoon without asking a single unnecessary question, and stayed in our guest room for 4 nights, cooking meals neither Daniel nor I had the energy to make. She had never fully trusted Priya, it turned out, something she confessed to me only after the fact, sheepish about never having said it sooner. She always complimented things a little too specifically, my mother said, standing at my stove the way Priya once had, though it felt entirely different now. Your haircut, your job, small things, like she was taking inventory. I hadn't noticed that pattern myself in 15 years of friendship, and hearing it named out loud by someone who'd only observed us together a handful of times each year made me feel, briefly, foolish, though my mother was quick to tell me that hindsight is a luxury nobody gets access to in the moment. Daniel's parents took it harder, in a different way. His mother cried on the phone the first time he told her the full story, less out of fear for us, and more, I think, out of a kind of retroactive horror at how close the ceremony itself had come to being disrupted, how much had been happening quietly beneath a wedding day she remembered as perfect. His father, a quiet, practical man, offered to pay for a home security system upgrade before we'd even asked, and drove up from Bend the following weekend to help install motion sensor lighting along our side yard himself, working in near silence for most of the afternoon, the kind of help that doesn't need to be discussed to be understood. He stayed for dinner that night, the first real meal at our table since everything had happened, and none of us mentioned Priya's name once, which felt, at the time, like its own small mercy. Word moved through our friend circle fast, the way it always does once the polite version of a story collapses under the weight of the real one. Renata called me crying, apologizing for ever having doubted what I'd told her, and became became, unexpectedly, one of the people who showed up hardest for us that summer, driving casseroles over, sitting with me on my porch some evenings when Daniel worked late and the house felt too quiet. Two other friends from the group went the opposite direction, distancing themselves in the careful, non-committal way people do when they don't want to pick a side but also don't want to keep showing up to something uncomfortable. I understood it, even as it hurt. 15 years is a long time to have built a shared history with someone, and not everyone was equipped to reckon with what that history had actually contained. Priya's employer, the clinic where she worked as a physician's assistant, placed her on administrative leave within a week of the arrest, pending an internal review that had nothing to do with us directly, but everything to do with the fact that a stalking charge doesn't sit quietly next to a medical license. I found out later, through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances neither of us had fully cut off, that she lost that job permanently by autumn. The clinic's review board apparently interviewed two of her former patients as part of the process, both of whom described her, unprompted, as attentive and warm, the kind of provider who remembered small details about their lives between visits. Reading that secondhand account later, through a mutual acquaintance who'd heard it from someone on the review board, was its own strange kind of dissonance. The same capacity for attentiveness that had made her a good caregiver was the same capacity she'd turned, in our direction, into surveillance. I felt something when I heard that news that surprised me. Not satisfaction, not quite, but something closer to grief. Whatever else Priya had become, she had once been genuinely good at her job, patient and thorough with patients who were frightened and in pain, and some version of her had built a real career doing something that mattered. I mourned that version of her a little, even while I understood she'd built her own downfall with her own hands. Daniel's firm never found out the full details, though Suresh clearly suspected something serious had happened after the lobby incident, and Daniel eventually told him a version stripped down to the essentials: an obsessive former friend, a restraining order, nothing more. His co-workers were kind about it in the careful way people are kind about things they don't fully understand, bringing him coffee some mornings, not asking questions he clearly didn't want to answer. Margaret called me twice that summer, both times late in the evening, both times mostly to apologize for things that weren't entirely her fault. She told me the second time that she'd finally gotten Priya to agree to inpatient treatment at a facility outside Salem, following the recommendation of a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation tied to the pending charges. I should have pushed for this years ago, Margaret said, her voice thin over the phone. I kept telling myself it was a private sadness, something she'd grow out of. I didn't want to believe my own daughter needed that kind of help. I think some part of me was scared of what it would mean if I admitted it. I told her I didn't blame her, and mostly by then I meant it. Margaret had spent 15 years managing a version of Priya's pain that she didn't fully understand, in isolation, without anyone to help carry it, and I recognized in her some of my own instinct to explain away things that should have alarmed me. There was a night, maybe 6 weeks after the arrest, when I sat on our back porch alone while Daniel showered, and I let myself grieve the friendship in a way I hadn't allowed myself to yet. Not the woman who'd stalked me, tracked my car, broken into my house. I felt nothing but relief and anger toward her. I grieved the other Priya, the one who'd held my hair back at 19, who'd sat with me through my father's hip surgery, who'd once driven 4 hours through an ice storm because I was crying too hard on the phone to finish a sentence. That Priya had been real too, at least some of the time. And I understood, sitting there in the dark, that I would probably spend years trying to reconcile the two versions of her that had lived inside the same person for as long as I'd known her. Some nights I still don't fully manage it. There were logistical complications that dragged on longer than the emotional ones, in some ways. Priya's name was still listed as an emergency contact on an old insurance form of mine from years earlier, something I had to track down and correct with 3 separate phone calls to a customer service line that kept transferring me. We discovered, going through old financial records during the restraining order process, that Priya had co-signed nothing, owed us nothing, and we owed her nothing either, except the $1,100 I'd paid back years before with interest she'd waived off, a debt that felt in hindsight less like generosity and more like an investment she'd been quietly tracking the whole time. The court case took until the following spring to fully resolve. Priya pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a suspended sentence contingent on continued psychiatric treatment and a 5-year no-contact order. I sat in the courtroom the day of the plea and watched her enter it, thinner than I remembered, dressed plainly, not once looking in my direction. In the gap between her arraignment and the plea deal, Priya made 2 more attempts to reach us, both technically within the letter of the temporary order, and both clearly designed to test its edges. The first was a sympathy card mailed to our house, ostensibly addressed to Biscuit, a dog she'd never met, adopted after the restraining order was already in place, decorated with a cartoon paw print and a note that read only, in her looping handwriting, "Thinking of your family." Our attorney told us to keep it, unopened at first, then photographed, as evidence of continued attempted contact. The second was stranger. She created a new social media account under a name that wasn't hers and followed 40-some accounts belonging to our mutual friends within a single afternoon. An obvious, clumsy attempt to keep a window open into our lives without technically approaching either of us directly. Renata recognized the profile picture, a stock photo of a mountain lake, within a day, and reported it before it ever reached us. Our attorney flagged both incidents to the district attorney's office, and I later learned they factored into the final terms of her plea, tightening the no-contact order to explicitly include indirect contact through third parties and false accounts, language her own defense attorney apparently didn't fight very hard. Our attorney attorney told us privately that in her experience, these small, deniable attempts at contact were common in the run-up to sentencing. A last flicker of control from someone watching the version of events they'd curated for years finally slip out of their hands entirely. There was also the matter of the shared storage unit. Years earlier, when Priya's old apartment building had been slated for a brief renovation, she'd asked to store a few boxes of books and winter clothing in a unit Daniel and I rented for out-of-season furniture, and none of us had ever bothered to formally divide the space since. Untangling that took an afternoon in November, both of us standing in a cold concrete hallway with a facility manager and a printed inventory list, sorting through boxes that hadn't been touched in 3 years, trying to figure out which coffee mugs and which paperback novels belonged to which life. We found, at the bottom of one box, an old friendship bracelet Priya and I had made in that first dorm room in 2010. Faded orange thread gone brittle with age. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't throw it away either. It's still in a drawer in my nightstand, for reasons I haven't fully worked out yet. Daniel found a stack of her old anatomy textbooks in the same box, the ones from her first year of PA school, dog-eared and heavily highlighted, and he set them aside without a word. And I understood he was thinking the same thing I was, that whoever had studied that hard, that seriously to build a career helping people, had once been someone neither of us needed to be afraid of. Our homeowner's insurance required a formal police report before they'd process a claim for the cost of rekeying the house twice, and replacing the desk drawer Priya had apparently pried open at some point to leave the defaced photograph, a detail we only pieced together once. A locksmith pointed out fresh scratch marks around the lock we'd never noticed ourselves. The claims adjuster asked flat, procedural questions over the phone that made the whole ordeal sound smaller than it had felt living through it. A few $100s of property damage reduced to a line item. Nothing in the paperwork capturing what it meant to stand in your own kitchen and realize a stranger had been living inside your life for months without your knowledge. It's been almost 2 years now since that dinner where I dropped my fork and my life quietly split into a before and after. Daniel and I still live in the same house, though we finally repainted the kitchen that fall. A small symbolic act neither of us discussed out loud, but both of us understood. We got a dog, a scruffy rescue mutt named Biscuit, mostly because Daniel wanted something in the house that would bark at strangers on the porch before they got close enough to knock. The doorbell camera is still there, though I check it less obsessively than I did that first year, when I used to pull up the footage every time I heard a car slow down on our street. I talk to Renata most weeks now, and to 2 of the other women from our old friend group, though the shape of that circle looks different than it did before. Smaller in some ways, and steadier in others. We don't organize elaborate group dinners the way we used to, back when Priya was the one who always sent the calendar invite and picked the restaurant. Now it's smaller gatherings, fewer people, more honesty, and I've come to prefer it that way. I haven't spoken to Priya since the courtroom, and under the terms of the order, I won't for a few more years yet. I think about her sometimes anyway, more than I expected I would. I heard, through Margaret, who still calls occasionally, that Priya completed her inpatient program and has been living with a cousin in Salem, working some kind of administrative job that doesn't require a medical license, slowly building something smaller and quieter than the life she used to have. I don't know if that's true recovery, or just a pause before the next escalation somewhere else, with someone else. I've made a kind of peace with not knowing, because chasing that answer was never going to give me anything back. Some days that peace feels solid. Other days it feels like something I'm still practicing, a muscle I have to consciously flex rather than a fact I've simply come to accept. What I've come to understand, turning this whole thing over in my mind for 2 years now, is that the most dangerous people are rarely the ones who look dangerous at the start. Priya never raised her voice at me in 15 years of friendship, not once, until the night she sat at my table and asked to split my husband like a household chore. She was patient and thorough, and endlessly good at making her own violations sound reasonable, and reasonable is exactly the trap. If she'd screamed at me, if she'd been cruel in ways I recognized from movies or warnings, I would have seen it coming. Instead, she was calm and specific, and entirely convinced of her own logic, and that calm is what let her walk into my house with a key I'd forgotten I ever gave her, and stand at my stove like she'd always belonged there. I don't think Priya believed she was a villain in any of this. I think in her mind she was owed something. 5 years of quiet devotion that nobody had properly acknowledged, a debt the universe hadn't yet repaid her for. That kind of entitlement doesn't announce itself with a raised fist. It announces itself gently, at a dinner table, over a pot roast going cold, with a smile that used to make me feel safe. We started seeing a couples therapist that first autumn, a woman named Dr. Patel, who worked out of a small office in Selwood, initially just to process the immediate trauma of it all, and then, gradually, to talk through the 8 months Daniel had carried those texts alone before telling me. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where I cried the entire 50 minutes, and sessions where Daniel sat in near silence, unable to find words for why he'd waited so long to hand me his phone. There were also sessions further along where we laughed for the first time about something unrelated entirely, a small, normal thing, and left the office afterward feeling lighter than we had in months, proof that the ordinary parts of our marriage hadn't been erased, just buried for a while under everything else. Dr. Patel told us once that secrecy, even secrecy meant to protect someone, has a way of becoming its own kind of harm, separate from whatever it was originally shielding us from. I think about that a lot now. I think Daniel does too. Daniel and I are stronger now than we were before any of this happened, though I wish I could could say that without the accompanying weight of everything it cost to get here. He told me once, in the thick of that first terrible month, that he wished he'd told me about the texts the day they started instead of 8 months into carrying them alone, and I believe that regret is real and lasting in him. We talk more now, about smaller things too, the kind of low-stakes daily worries we used to let slide, because we assumed we had endless time to get around to them eventually. I don't assume that anymore. There's a version of this story where I get to feel simply triumphant, where the ending is clean and I walk away only relieved, only certain, only glad it's over. That's not quite where I've landed. I still feel a specific, particular grief for the friend I thought I had for 15 years, the one who sat with me through my father's surgery, who drove through an ice storm because I needed her, who I genuinely believed right up until the night she asked to split my husband was one of the most loyal people in my life. That person may have been real, some of the time, in some rooms. She's also gone now, folded into a person I no longer recognize and can't safely be near, and some nights that loss still catches me off guard, quiet and unexpected, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary evening. What I know for certain is that I will never again mistake calm for safety, or history for proof of character, or someone's willingness to show up for me in a crisis as evidence they'd never manufacture one of their own. I loved my best friend for 15 years. I also learned the hard way that love and safety are not always the same thing, and that the people closest to you are sometimes the ones best positioned to hurt you precisely because you never thought to build a wall in that direction. Some evenings, Daniel and I sit out on that same back porch where I first let myself grieve her, Biscuit curled up between our feet, the motion sensor lights his father installed glowing faint along the fence line, and the ordinariness of it still catches me somewhere unexpected. No air tags, no footsteps in the kitchen, no candles burning in a shrine 2 miles away, just two people who survived something together still learning how to trust the quiet. My best friend once sat at my dinner table and calmly announced she deserved half my husband. I didn't give him to her, but I gave up something else that night too, something I'm still learning how to grieve, the 15 years I thought I understood, and the version of her I'll never quite get to keep believing in again.